Well, the internet is obviously a tremendous research tool. We use it all the time. I assume by internet you mean more generally the whole kind of IT system that's developed. It's certainly useful for activists and organizers. Almost all activist efforts and enterprises involve intercommunication through the internet. On the other hand, we don't have to talk about the fact that it's a tremendous tool for power systems to control and dominate in all sorts of ways. I, by now, hardly have to mention the NSA revelations, Edward Snowden's revelations. Commercial institutions like Google, for example, use it to undermine privacy and independence in all kinds of ways. So the balance of power is where it always was and expanding. Any technology that's around is going to be used by systems of concentrated power to dominate and control. And you can't open a newspaper now without new things appearing. So take this morning. If you happen to look at this morning's newspaper, there was a report of an Associated Press, some revelations that they've dug out recently about efforts to develop by the U.S. government through USAID, which is supposed to be an aid organization, to carry forward the intensive U.S. efforts to undermine and overthrow the government of Cuba. You read the report, it's interesting for what it says and what it doesn't say. What it says is that the government, through USAID, has tried to set up a kind of a social media inside Cuba that could be used to organize crowds to protest with the people not really knowing who they're working for and what they're doing. And the original AP report, most of which didn't get printed, at least in what I saw, says that this has already been used in many other places, the Philippines, Ukraine, and so on, to try to organize anti-government protests, which raises quite a few questions about what's going on around the world. Well, this is one of the techniques that's being used for subversion, domination, control. This is an Obama program, incidentally, not Bush. And what's said is interesting. What isn't said is interesting. And here, the power of the internet looms in the background. You can quickly find out what isn't said on the internet if you look for it. What isn't said is that this program of course, it's not called subversion, it's called bringing democracy and so on, but this program of trying to subvert the Cuban government is part of a long-standing war that the U.S. has been conducting against Cuba. Long-standing. You look at the history of the U.S. and Cuba, it starts in the 1820s. Cuba was regarded by the founding fathers as the next conquest that we have to make. Cuba was waiting there, just we had to take it for ourselves as we expand and become the greatest empire in the world. Well, he couldn't do it in 1823. There was a deterrent, the British. They were too powerful. The British were the main enemy through most of the 19th century. But the big thinkers like John Quincy Adams, the great grand strategist, he recognized and said that while we can't acquire Cuba now, it will fall into our hands by the laws of political gravitation, just as an apple falls from a tree, meaning in time the U.S. will become more powerful, Britain's power will decline, and we'll be able to take Cuba. And in fact, that's what happened. In 1898, Cuba was liberating itself from Spain, and the U.S. intervened in what's called here liberation of Cuba, but in fact was the prevention of the liberation of Cuba by Cubans. The U.S. took over the island, one of several. Puerto Rico, Hawaii was stolen from its inhabitants the same year, and Cuba became a colony, virtual colony. Well, something quite interesting happened that's highly relevant today, highly relevant, but never mentioned. But you can find it on the internet if you like. At gunpoint, the U.S. imposed a treaty on Cuba, Platt Amendment it's called, in which Cuba granted the United States control over eastern Cuba. It's what we call Guantanamo. Happens to include Cuba's major port. Its only port oriented towards Europe, which is where its main trade would be. Of course, the Cubans had no voice in this. We just took it over. Actually, there's something, and we've had it for 110 years. Cuba's been trying to get it back, but we refuse. The purpose has no strategic interest for us. It's used for storage of refugees, like if Haitians flee from monstrous dictatorships that we support in Haiti. We're supposed to accept them under international law as refugees, but instead you send them off to Cuba, to Guantanamo, as a storage place. Of course, it's used as a torture chamber. The Cubans want it back, and we won't give it to them. Does this remind you of something that's happening in world affairs right now? Yeah. Russia took over Crimea, okay? Just as we've taken over eastern Cuba for 110 years at gunpoint. We don't formally annex it, but we dominate it. Russia has a much stronger case than the United States does. Crimea is primarily Russian. Its population overwhelmingly supports Russia. It's got major strategic significance. It's Russia's only warm water port. It's the base for their fleet. It's right on the border of Russia. Russia's surrounded by a hostile military alliance, NATO, and for them it's of great strategic significance. For Cuba, for us, is nothing. Guantanamo, it's just a means of trying to undermine Cuba, prevent Cuban development. And the United States, of course, has been at war with Cuba since 1959, when Cuba finally did liberate itself. Immediately, the U.S. began an attack on Cuba. Under Kennedy, a massive terrorist operation was organized to bring the terrors of the earth to Cuba. It was Arthur Schlesinger's phrase describing it in his biography of Robert Kennedy, who was in charge of it. It almost destroyed the world. It was a major factor that led to the missile crisis. And it's went on afterwards. The terror based in Florida has gone on almost without a stop. On top of that, there's an economic embargo to strangle the country, opposed by the entire world. Take a look at the votes, annual votes in the General Assembly, which don't get reported here. It's 180 to 2 U.S. and Israel, sometimes Marshall Islands or something. Well, all of this is part of the background to the AP story about today's effort to subvert the government of Cuba. Well, coming back to the internet, what's interesting is what is available and what isn't readily available, because people don't see it. Like, you won't find a word about anything I said in the press or in commentary or discussion, although it's all extremely timely, very timely, not arcane scholarship, but it's right in front of our eyes, but not there. And when you come back to the power of the internet, I think comes back to us. We don't use it. We don't use the resource for the purposes for which it could be used to break through silence, oppression, domination, terror, violence, bring the reality of the world to people. So the internet potentially is a wonderful tool, but only if you decide to use it. If you decide to leave it in the hands of private power, of power systems, whether state or private, sure, it'll be used as a way to oppress and undermine and dominate. But that's a choice. Don't have to.
Well, on that note, we will